Most people don't know this, but in 1798, the US and essentially independent Haiti, which at that time was the island of Saint Domingue, had very warm and friendly relations and extremely active trade relations between the two. We could call them nations. The US was definitely a nation. Saint Domingue was sort of in this messy transition period in the 1790s. But for all practical purposes, it was autonomous and led by an autonomous ruler by the name of Toussaint Louverture, who was a former slave, and most of his military officers were also former slaves. And they had carried out a successful slave rebellion just after the French Revolution of 1789. But bottom line is, John Adams was trading with the section of Saint Domingue that was under Louverture's control, which was the vast majority of the entire island. And US trade made up about 80 to 90% of all of Saint Domingue's trade. And you had thousands of American workers actually living at the port towns in Saint Domingue to facilitate all this trade between the two, we could call them nations. And Louverture himself, in a letter in 1799, said the commerce of the US is indispensable to Saint Domingue. But once a slavery president, Thomas Jefferson, slave owner and promoter of long-term slavery, becomes president in 1800, he cuts off all trade relations and all relations in general with Saint Domingue, with Louverture, simply because, it was a nation made out of a slave rebellion. And so someone who was a political tool for the Southern slavery oligarchy, Jefferson, couldn't carry on relations with that sort of entity. And he even placed trade sanctions on Saint Domingue. So 1800 to 1825, zero hope of US having any sort of relations with Saint Domingue or what became the independent country of Haiti in 1804, because we have Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, three, political tools of the Southern slavery oligarchy, all three slave owners themselves from Virginia, and who were advocates for the long-term, forever presence of slavery, legal slavery in the United States. But, essentially it's sad because from 1800 all the way to 1860, the US has zero relations, zero diplomatic or trade relations with independent Haiti, simply because of this stranglehold on US Congress by the Southern congressmen. And probably a lot of that also has to do with this ridiculous 3/4 of a person law that gave every Southern plantation owner, every Southern slave owner, 3/4 of an extra vote for every slave they owned. This is something that the South negotiated at the very beginning, very outset of the United States, and basically would not have actually joined into this federation of a country if the North had not agreed to allow them to have those 3/4 extra votes. And so that gave the South more representatives in Congress than they should have really had. And that helped them keep a stranglehold on certain aspects of US policy, including slavery, including Haiti. And by the way, I'm not blaming average Southern white people here. I'm talking about the elites, the power holders, those who had political and economic power in the South. These were the people who really kept the US from progressing. And so as soon as these politicians leave Congress in 1861, which is when the South seceded and became the Confederacy, Lincoln proposes a bill to recognize both Haiti and Liberia. With the South now out of Congress, the bill passes in a landslide. So it was something like 84 to 37 in the House and something like 34 to 7 in the Senate. Those were the vote counts in favor of recognizing Haiti and Liberia. So this is extremely telling of who it was during all those 60 years that was holding the US back from recognizing Haiti. It was clearly the Southern congressmen. And these landslide votes show us that without a doubt. And to add to that, those who voted no, they were congressmen from the border states. So the small amount of votes against were still from states that had this sort of Southern culture, this Southern slavery loving culture that stems back to, the days of the Virginia colony in the 17th century. But I digress. If we look back to this period of 1800 to 1862, when there were no relations whatsoever between the US and Haiti, we see multiple attempts by Northern congressmen to sort of put forward proposals and petitions to recognize Haiti, which were struck down by Southern congressmen before they even reached, a full House vote or full Senate vote. The Southern congressmen found ways to essentially table these proposals, just sent them to committees where they were stacked with Southerners and border state congressmen who basically struck down the proposals in those committees prior to it even getting to a vote. But this happened multiple times. So in 1825, Monroe leaves office and John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, becomes president. And he puts forth the largest sort of development project, nationwide development project that the US had ever seen. In addition to that project, he also pushed for reestablishing diplomatic relations and trade relations with Haiti, which, like I said, the South struck down. But he became a congressman after his 4-year stint as president and put forth more proposals that, again, got struck down by the South during his years in Congress, all the way up until 1850. And there were other Northern congressmen throughout those years, 1825 to 1862, who put forth similar petitions to recognize Haiti, namely William Slade of Vermont, an abolitionist, Henry Wilson, a senator from Massachusetts, Thaddeus Stevens, congressman from Pennsylvania, and Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts. All of these Northern congressmen put forth proposals to recognize Haiti during those years. And in 1858, as we're getting closer to the Civil War, we're essentially getting into a period when the North was becoming more and more frustrated with the South because, in the early years of the 1800s, a lot of them thought the South would at some point relent and accept some sort of gradual emancipation plan. I mean, most Northern congressmen couldn't conceive of a republic that talked about freedom for all men and all men created equal that wouldn't at some point end slavery. It was definitely a contradiction in terms for them. But essentially, time and again, throughout the 19th century up until 1860s, the South shows that it's completely unwilling to make serious compromises and head towards the road, at least, of eventually ending slavery. So as the North gets more frustrated, they form this major anti-slavery coalition, which included both gradual emancipation advocates and immediate abolitionists. And that became the good old party, what we know today as the Republican Party. And so in those years in the late 1850s, they actually openly debated in Congress. It didn't just get tabled by the Southern congressmen into some sort of side committee. They openly debated whether or not to recognize Haiti, and there are congressional records of those debates. And then, of course, we see those landslide votes in favor of recognition once the South leaves Congress in 1861. So, point is, it wasn't as though Northern congressmen were simply just using Southern pressure as an excuse not to recognize Haiti. The Northern congressmen were actually pushing actively to recognize Haiti, and the South was using its political power to table those petitions every single time. So, when you hear this modern narrative out there that, the North was completely complicit with Southern slavery, and essentially the program was that the Southern cotton fields and tobacco fields were generating this money that then got sent up to investment in Northern capitalist industry, and that's what created the development of America. That's hogwash. And that comes from people who don't understand the history going back to the 1600s and who these distinct cultures were. I'm talking about two very distinct cultures that founded the Northeast states and the Southeast states. And if you don't understand the sociology of that, if you don't understand the English Civil Wars, which were really an English Revolution in the mid 1600s, where the political factions from that upheaval in England, Wales, and Scotland went when they arrived in North America, then you really don't understand American history at all. And if you buy into that narrative, that extremely simplified narrative of, Northern industrialists teaming up with Southern slavery oligarchy, then you really haven't done your research. And honestly, most people haven't done their research on the English Civil Wars, the founding of Massachusetts versus Virginia, etc. Now, again, I just want to put forth a disclaimer that the people in the wrong here were the Southern elites, the slavery oligarchy, and their political machine. And, the people who hired and fired and held slaves, owned land, and had some sort of say in how those Southern colonies and later Southern states were governed. We're talking basically only about 3% of Southern people, of Southern white people. The other 97% of Southerners back then are not to blame. And I think that's really important in saying, there's no sense in just pointing a finger at the South, at red states. No, you need to understand what the culture was that came to those Southern colonies in the first place, which were royalist Anglicans, and they were just a materialistic culture that didn't have any valuable principles to their name. Not only were they in love with slavery, they were in love with hierarchy. That's really important to know. And they also wanted to keep not just the slaves, but the entire populace uneducated. So hopefully I'll have time later on to make a video on those two distinct cultures, the Northeast and the Southeast, from their very foundings all the way up until, say, 1965, the Civil Rights Act. But let's head back to the 1790s.